Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I am your host Keith Crockford. And today we are on episode 102 of the podcast, which is amazing that we're getting so far through it and covering off loads and loads of different topics. Now, for the next few weeks, I've put together a little series of episodes that look at the questions that we get asked at the Bucket List Company. Obviously, being a company that organises these tours all the way around the world, we definitely do get asked lots and lots of questions in the office. So what I thought I'd do is collate all of those questions and answer them all on episodes of the podcast. So rather than having to answer lots of questions that are coming in, hopefully we can cover them all off and you can be more informed about different trips that we do. So I thought today that I would start off looking at the top FAQs that we get asked for Kilimanjaro, which is obviously one of our most popular treks. We had a group summit yesterday on Kilimanjaro. They did the Marangu route yesterday, and we had a great success again with everybody reaching the top of Kilimanjaro from our group, which is just absolutely amazing. And one thing we strive to do for every single trip. So I went through and looked at through our social media and emails that come into the company, emails that come into the office and phone calls that people get asked, that we get asked, and thought I'd just go through the top FAQs for Kilimanjaro. So at number one, the top question we get asked about Kilimanjaro is, when is the best time of the year to climb Kilimanjaro? Well, the important thing here is Kilimanjaro can be climbed year round. Plenty of people climb it all year round. Kilimanjaro is never closed as a mountain. Like, for example, the Inca Trail is closed during the wet season. That doesn't happen on Kilimanjaro. You can climb it 365 days of the year. But having said that, the best time to climb Kilimanjaro is in the dry season, which is generally from June through to October, and then also December through to March. These periods are considered the optimal times for climbing because the weather is typically drier, with clearer skies and lower rain levels. But obviously, having said that, you do always start off your trip in the rainforest, depending on the majority of the routes start off in the rainforest area. So there are always going to be the risks of a little bit of rain. But obviously, once you come out of the rainforest, then what you want is great views and clear skies. So like I said, the best time to go is generally, and I always say, like, June and September for me are the perfect times for climbing Kilimanjaro. But you've got the dry season from June to October, and then also again from December to March. So lots of people climb it for New Year, around the Christmas period. So they are also great options. But for me, June and September, I always think, are the perfect times for climbing Kilimanjaro. So that answers off that question. The second question that we get asked so many times is, how difficult is Kilimanjaro? Or how difficult is it to climb Kilimanjaro? Now, I got slated for this on a podcast that we put on social media. We put a snippet of the podcast on social media, and it was our best ever performing post on TikTok and Instagram. But there was lots of people who slated my comment, and I still stand by my comment. And my comment is that Kilimanjaro is not a technical climb. Kilimanjaro is a trekking peak and it is a hike, and that's what I said. And people came back going, "Oh, you're saying it's too easy. You're not giving a true representation of it." and my comment is that you don't require any technical climbing skills or equipment to do Kilimanjaro, even though it's a mountain. It is a trekking peak rather than a technical climb. That is true. You need to put one foot in front of the other and you will get to the top. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need any special training. Even though Kilimanjaro is nearly 6,000 meters, it is still a trekking peak and you just need to walk up. Obviously, though, there is the issues of acclimatization, etc., etc. So in terms of that, if we look at it from that point of view, Kilimanjaro is just a trek. You put one foot in front of the other and you will get to the top. However, I always say to my groups when we're on Kilimanjaro is that, for the first few days, you'll be thinking, what's all the issues about? This is really easy. This isn't a problem. Like, I'm coping with this really well. And then summit night comes and that just is a whole new ball game when summit night appears. And that's when you'll then think it's the hardest thing you've probably ever done in your life. And that's completely true. But what I will say is that it is still very doable. You just need to have the mental ability to be able to push on and get it done. And I always say to people, climbing Kilimanjaro is 60 to 70% mental and 30 to 40% physical. So if you are in good physical condition, there is no reason why you can't complete Kilimanjaro. In fact, I had two people on my trip last year that when we got to the airport, their first comment to me was, we should have really trained for this. We had planned to train for this, but time got away for us and we haven't really done anything. And they both managed to get to the top. Now, although they struggled and they probably didn't enjoy it as much as they could have done, they still managed to get to the top. They wanted to do it. They put mind over matter. They had some help from the porters and they got to the top. But obviously, if you are coming into it in good physical shape, the chances are you're going to enjoy it a whole lot more than that. So it is doable for everybody. If you can put one foot in front of the other, it is completely doable. But I will say that the fitter you are before you go into it, the more you are going to enjoy it. Next question that we get asked is, which route should I do? And we've done podcasts on this already, so I'm not really going to go into too much detail on this one. But there are 7 different routes up the mountain. 6 of them you are staying in tents. 1 of them you are staying in huts. It's only the Marangu route that you get to stay in the huts, and a lot of people choose that route because of that. It allows you to, have a bit more space. You're not staying in a tent. I think it's slightly warmer. You get to sleep on a mattress. And that appeals to a lot of people. And a lot of people say to me that if the Marangu route wasn't there with huts, they probably wouldn't have done Kilimanjaro because they don't want to stay in tents. So I kind of get that. With regards to the other routes, you've got the Machame, which is probably the most popular on the mountain. We don't offer that one as an offering just because of how busy it is. We would rather do the Lemosho route. You've also got the Rongai route coming in from the north, almost starting from Kenya, which has a really nice altitude profile as well. But yeah, so we offer the Marangu and the Lemosho. We think they give the best 2 options on the mountain for what people want to achieve. But do your research. They have different altitude profiles. They're over different durations of days. So, depending on how you want to do it, what your budget is, that's kind of going to determine what route it is you do. But like I said, we've got loads of information on that one. We've done a podcast purely on all the routes. So I'm not going to go into that in more detail. But just to say that there are 7 different ones. Those are the 2 that we do, the Marangu and the Lemosho. And they all have different benefits, and really you need to research which one's going to give you the best opportunity for you, really. Another question is can I do Kilimanjaro on my own in terms of not going with a guide or a company? And the answer to that is no, you can't. The Kilimanjaro National Park have put in place that you have to use a local tour operating company and you have to have guides and staff with you. So you can't just rock up and climb Kilimanjaro. The national park is fenced, it's gated. You have to go through, you have to sign the book. When you get to a hut or a campsite, you need to sign in there to say that you've got in there so they know exactly who's on the mountain. So you do need to go with a local guide. Obviously, there are various different ways of doing that. You can book it with a company in the UK before you go. You could turn up in Tanzania and find a company to take you. There are lots of different options there, but you do need to have a local guide, and then they will sort all of your permits and passes out to get into the national park. That will all be done for you. And that goes on to the next question, was how much does a Kilimanjaro climb cost? Now, Kilimanjaro is expensive compared to other multi-day treks, Everest Base Camp, for example, Machu Picchu. Kilimanjaro is a lot more expensive than to have the trip than those are. And the reason for that is the park fees that you pay to the national park. And you pay those fees on a per day basis. And that's what I was saying earlier on about the routes and different durations in your budget. Because you pay per day, there are some routes that will take you 5 days and there are some routes that will take you 10 days. The 10-day one is obviously a lot more expensive because you are paying per day to be on the mountain itself. And it is quite a lot of money that the national park charges for the climb. And that's why whenever you look at a Kilimanjaro cost, it is a lot more expensive for a shorter duration than like an Everest Base Camp trek, for example. Like your permits for Everest Base Camp would be $75 for the 13 days you are in the national park. That would be your permit fees. For Kilimanjaro, you're paying nearly $100 per day for every day that you are on the mountain. So, if you are doing a 10-day route on the mountain, $1,000 of your cost is going to be your permit fees just to be there. So that is obviously the main cost of Kilimanjaro is the permit fees. And I always, we always get comments in the office where people are going, "Oh, you're very expensive, this, that, and the other." But what I will say to people is, if you're considering that your permit fees are nearly $100 per day, if you look at the cost of your trip, sometimes I see trips advertised that are only a little bit higher than the cost of the permit fees. And I think to myself, well, how much are those people paying their porters? How much are they paying their guides? What are they feeding, the clients whilst they're on the mountain, if they are doing it that cheaply? So just bear that in mind that, you might see a really cheap cost for a trip to Kilimanjaro, but also then think, what are they not paying for, or who is not getting paid very well in this trip? And we kind of make sure that, there are associations out there that companies sign up to make sure that they are kitting their porters out properly. They are paying a fair wage. They are looking after their guides. And there is a process in place for those local operators to join those organizations to say, look, we look after our staff, we look after our porters, but there are plenty of operators that aren't signed up to one of those schemes. So just do a bit of research on who it is you're using to make sure that that the people who are looking after you are also being looked after as well. Another one we get asked is, are there any age restrictions for climbing Kilimanjaro? There is no upper age limit for climbing Kilimanjaro. If you are fit and healthy, then there is no upper age limit at all for climbing Kili. Down at the younger end, we get a lot of people asking us, do you take children on a Kilimanjaro trek? I want to do it with my children. The national park have set a level of that you can climb Kilimanjaro as a 10-year-old. There are the youngest person ever to climb Kilimanjaro was actually only 5. And obviously they must have got special permissions or whatever. But the Kilimanjaro, the national parks state that you can climb it from 10 years old. Things obviously to bear in mind with that is, if you are taking your children, then ultimately you are responsible for your children. And that's what we say to people. If your child needs to go down, you're going to need to go down with them. If you need to go down, then obviously your child is also going to have to come down with you. You don't want your child going off with a porter or a local guide. Like you are responsible for your children on the mountain, and that's what we say to people. So as long as people are happy with that and they bear that in mind, then bringing young people onto Kilimanjaro is definitely not a problem. And like I said, there is no upper age limit. And if you are fit and healthy, you can do it. And don't use age as a barrier to stop you going ahead. Another question we get asked quite a lot is, what do I need to pack for a Kilimanjaro trek? Now, obviously, in terms of when you're on the mountain, you are going to be carrying a day pack with you with your stuff that you need just for that day. Your duffel bag, which will be carried by the porters, will have all of your kit in it. Obviously, depending on how long the route's going to be, is going to depend on how much stuff you need to have with you. The porters will generally carry 12 kilos of weight in your duffel bag, depending on which company you use. Ours will carry 12 kilos. I've heard of some companies carrying 10 kilos per person, but ours will carry 12 kilos of your luggage. So kind of you need to think about, what do I need? And I've got to fit it in to 12 kilos. Obviously, you're going to need your sleeping bag. If you're on a camped route, you might want to take a roll mat with you or an inflatable mat to sleep on for a comfier night's sleep. Your trekking company might provide you with roll mats. So that's one thing to check out beforehand. Obviously, if you are on a tented route, all of that equipment will be provided by your local provider. If you're in the hut routes, then you just need to have your sleeping bag to put down on the mattress when you get into the huts in the evening. You will need a pair of walking boots. And I always say to people that, to be honest, you can pretty much get away with wearing an approach shoe, but I wouldn't wear an approach shoe on summit night, just because on the way back down, there is a lot of scree, and there is a lot of opportunity to roll your ankles. So what I generally do is wear an approach shoe up until summit night, and then I'll put my walking boots on, which are slightly warmer as well, and it does get a lot colder when you're there on summit night. Then obviously the important thing is layers. You are going to need to have lots and lots of layers with you, and that's one of the biggest issues with Kilimanjaro is the temperature difference between starting off at the gate and then finishing on summit night, because you can pretty much have a 50-degree temperature change between the gate and the summit. I've started in 30 degrees C in shorts and t-shirt, and on the way up, I've been in -20 wind chill. So you need to make sure the equipment you're taking with you will cover you for that whole difference. So having lots of layers is the way to do it. You're going to need to have an insulated jacket, whether that's a synthetic one or whether it's a down jacket for summit night. You're going to need to have a head torch, because you're going to set off at, you're going to set off at around about 11, 12 o'clock in the evening, and you're going to spend the first 5-6 hours of your summit night in pitch black. So you need to have a good head torch with good batteries in it and spare batteries as well. Obviously, warm hat, 2 pairs of gloves. You're going to want a thin pair of gloves and then a thicker waterproof pair of gloves to go over the top of your thin gloves. You certainly don't want to be having very much bare skin on show on summit night if you get a really cold spell one. So lots of layers, those, and then there is still space for a few luxuries there. Like, if you pack well, you can take snacks with you. And because one of the questions we get asked a lot is, what's the food like on Kilimanjaro? And I will say you get fed really well on Kilimanjaro, bearing in mind where they are and they're cooking your food on a mountain. You do get fed very, very well. What I will say to people, though, is it's very different from an Everest base camp trek where you choose off a menu and you can decide what you want. They are only cooking one option. And if you are a little bit of a fussy eater, then you just need to think about that with what you're taking with you to supplement on the way up. For breakfast, generally they'll do porridge. They will do like sausages or eggs in toast. That's the kind of standard breakfast that you will get on the mountain. Lunch, depending on how they do it, depending on where your stops are going to be that day, it might be a pack up lunch that they'll give you in the morning, or it might be that you will get into camp in the early afternoon, then have lunch as soon as you get into camp, then have a cooked lunch whilst you get in camp. And then your evening meal then will be high carbs, pastas, potatoes, that kind of food to fill you back up again at the end of the day, like fruit at the end. There's always tea, coffee. When you get into camp, there'll generally be popcorn or biscuits as a snack when you arrive into camp. And like the one thing I will always say to people again is just make sure that if you are in a group and you're traveling with a group, that you are looking after your hygiene and making sure everybody else is looking after their hygiene as well. Popcorn on a table for me is one of the biggest problems on an expedition, because obviously people go in, everyone's hands are all going into the same food. I always say to people, use a spoon it into a bowl, spoon it onto a plate so that everybody is not touching the same food. Because if one person's got a bug, the last thing you want to happen is then for that bug to go through the whole group. So just bear that one in mind as well when you're eating and thinking about communal meals, etc. Finally, for the question I want to cover now is, what's the success rate for reaching the summit of Kilimanjaro? Which is, obviously a completely fair question. People are paying a lot of money to go and climb Kilimanjaro. You want to know what the success rate is. And the success rate, to be honest, is going to be pretty dependent on which route and the duration that you take it for. The average success rate at Kilimanjaro is 60%. Across all the routes, they say the average success rate is 60%. If you do the Marangu over 5 days, for example, they actually give that as an average of 45%. A lot of people choose to do that because it's obviously the cheapest route you can do, because it's a 5-day route, going back to what we were talking about earlier about the permits for the days. Now, what I will say is we do the Marangu route over 6 days. And for the last few years, our success rate has been around 98% for all of our Kilimanjaro trips, which when you consider the average is 60%, I don't think that is too bad whatsoever. And people ask me why we've got such a good success rate on Kilimanjaro. And I think, it generally goes down to our team of people who are looking after you. And they our team really want to get everyone to the top if they want to get there. And obviously you haven't turned up to go there and not get to the top. And they will do everything that they can to get people to the top of Kilimanjaro. For example, on summit night, we work on a 1-to-1 ratio with porters or guides to clients. So, there is somebody there to help you. And I've seen it on so many occasions that, we'll set off at 11 o'clock at night to go for the summit. And groups will set off after us and come flying past us. And within an hour, they're turned around and coming back down again. And I think it's just the way that our guides look after the groups. They know how to get a group to the top of the mountain. And I think so many guides are there that do the same thing every time. And if you can't keep up with them, or you can't stick to that pace and you need to turn around and come back down, they'll just turn around and come back down. Or if you say to some of them, like, oh, I'm feeling a bit tired. Whereas our guides will sit there and go, well, give me your rucksack. Like, come on, we'll do 10 paces at a time. Let's go. Others will just go, okay, let's go back down then. And they won't give you that opportunity because they've had their payday. And, it's such a shame that you see that, but we do see it on the mountain. And I do really think it's one of the reasons why our success rate is so high. Although our clients are amazing, they're no different to anyone else. We're not getting the fittest people book with us. Like I said to you earlier, we had 2 people that rocked up to the airport and said, we should have really trained for this. We haven't done anything. And they still managed to get to the top. So I think it's the way you are looked after on the mountain. That's what's going to help you with the success rate. And if you really want to get there and it is safe for you to do so, then our guides will keep going and push you to the top as much as they can. So like I said before, we run 2 different trips at the Bucket List Company. We do the Marangu route over 6 days, and then we do the Lemosho route as well. One is tented, one is in huts, as we've already said. So depending on which type of accommodation you want to go for. And, on the Marangu route, for example, in the huts, there are toilet blocks with Western toilets. Again, that for some people, that is what they want. Whereas if you're on a Lemosho route or a Bachame route, then you are going to be using toilet tents in portaloos. And, again, on the Lemosho route, our groups have their own separate toilet tents. But some people just don't like using toilet tents, and that's not why they want to climb Kilimanjaro. So just give the route choice some real thought when you are thinking about it. What I'll do in the show notes is I'll also put some links, because I've done a video on what you should pack for Kilimanjaro, which is on YouTube, and I'll put a link to that so you can see it in more detail as well, if that's one of the questions that you're sort of thinking about. But if you've got any other questions on Kilimanjaro, which hopefully after listening to this podcast, we should have cleared most of them up. But if you have got any questions and you do want to ask something, then please do send an email into the office and we can get that question answered for you. And maybe at some point we'll need to do a part 2 on the Kilimanjaro FAQ if there are any more questions that we haven't covered off. But I think I've pretty much covered off every question or the most common questions that come in regarding Kilimanjaro. Hopefully you found this episode interesting. And if you've got Kilimanjaro on your bucket list, then please head to our website. There is loads more information on there. And I also wrote an 88-page guide to Kilimanjaro, which has all the information on all the routes, gives you all the technical details on the routes in terms of distances per days, altitude profiles, etc. So if that would be of interest, I'll also put a link to download that into the show notes as well. But that's everything from me for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk. or follow us on socials. See you next time.